You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I am back again with yet more Acker for you. This is my first video I'm scripting after my end-of-year break in the last week of 2023. Let's hope I haven't lost my mojo after a week of ridiculous stomach cramps after drinking some almond holiday nog. Because for some reason the grocery store around here stopped stocking nog while it was still the first half of Christmas. Anyway, we're not here for me to whine about the fact that I might now be allergic to almonds, or, I guess, nog? Anyway, we're here to talk about Acker. Pam has just finished telling us about how she thinks birds aren't dinosaurs and didn't evolve from them. Mostly because the Richard Carrier of paleontology, Alan Fiducia, says so. Now we're going to hear about her fourth icon, dinosaurs. Which, yes, sounds a whole lot like her last icon, but whatever.
So this brings us nicely to my fourth icon, which is dinosaurs. Now, if you look at this image, or you've ever looked in a book about dinosaurs, all you will see when dinosaurs are being presented is dinosaurs, right? You never see anything else running around with the dinosaurs. You never see anything modern looking with the dinosaurs.
Really? Because this is a picture of a dinosaur with the non-dinosaur Sarcosuchus. Here are some dinosaurs depicted with non-dinosaur pterosaurs. Here's a dinosaur with a mammal. Here's a dinosaur depicted with termites. Here's a picture of a dinosaur having caught a sawtooth fish. Here's a man holding a dinosaur. Seems like Pam is, once again, just lying.
It's all about the dinosaurs.
I mean, yeah, pictures of dinosaurs tend to be of dinosaurs, just like pictures of bears tend to be of bears, and pictures of gazelle tend to be about gazelle. Is Pam just complaining that when people make images of something, they tend to put the subject of that image in the most prominent place in the picture? Look, here's a picture of Jesus. Notice how there are no horses, or lions, or cows, or chickens, or vultures, or women, or snails, or sharks, or clouds, or butterflies, or cups, or lead pipes, or pyramids, or gladiators, or horses. Did I already say horses? I did already say horses. Or piles of manure, even though all of those things existed at the same time as Jesus. What kind of crazy conspiracy is this? Are the Christians trying to make us forget about all the things except for Jesus? Maybe that's what's happening. Or maybe, it's just a picture of Jesus and doesn't need to have everything else in the world it possibly could.
And there was a gentleman by the name of Carl Werner. He produced a book called Living Fossils. I believe it took him about 20 years traveling around the world, asking museum curators to show him fossils. And he kept asking initially, can you show me fossils of any modern animals that were buried with dinosaurs? And they'd say, oh, no. There are no modern animals were buried in the same strata as dinosaurs.
This is correct. There are no animals alive today who have fossils in the Mesozoic. There are certainly lineages alive today that have changed little since then, such as termites, sharks, some crocodilians, some lizards, etc. But none are identical.
So then he changed his question a little bit, and he said, can you show me animals can you show me any birds that were found in strata buried with dinosaurs? And they say, oh yeah, we can show you some birds. Can you show me any fish? Oh yeah, we can show you some fish. Can you show me any reptiles? Oh yeah. Can you show me any mammals? Oh yeah, we can show you mammals that were buried in the same strata as dinosaurs.
Yeah, all of those things are things that evolved before the dinosaurs, with the exception of birds, which are dinosaurs, and mammals, which along with birds evolved in the Jurassic, depending on how exacting you are with the word bird and mammal.
Now, remember what I said about the fossil record earlier, and they think that everything is laid down sequentially?
Because that's how logic in physics works, yes.
So if I'm found in the same strata, that means I'm the same age, regardless of whether you're accepting an evolutionary view or a flood view.
That's true.
Okay, so mammals coexisted with dinosaurs.
Yes.
Birds coexisted with dinosaurs.
Yes.
Modern reptiles coexist with dinosaurs.
Well, dinosaurs are reptiles, as are birds, but no modern reptiles lived with dinosaurs. You can't just add the word modern in there without actually demonstrating a species alive today that you can verify was alive at the time of the dinosaurs. Or, if I'm being generous, one that's been alive at any time since the start of the modern era. Which I'll be generous with and give the start date of 1400, which is well earlier than what most people would consider the modern era.
Modern fish coexist with dinosaurs.
Nope, see my previous response about reptiles.
You're never told this, you're never shown this, you're just shown this. Dinosaurs coexist with dinosaurs.
Weird, because I remember this. Really? Because this is a picture of a dinosaur with the non-dinosaur Sarcosuchus. Here are some dinosaurs depicted with non-dinosaur pterosaurs. Here's a dinosaur with a mammal. Here's a dinosaur depicted with termites. Here's a picture of a dinosaur having caught a sawtooth fish. Here's a man holding a dinosaur. Seems like Pam is, once again, just lying.
Millions of years before anything else was around.
You know, that seemed like bullshit to me, but then again, I'm probably closer in my knowledge of Paleozoic fauna to the people working at the museums than I am to Pam and people like her. So I decided to ask my dad, my younger brother, my best friend, my sister, her husband, and one of my nephews, what things, besides dinosaurs, they thought were around during the time of dinosaurs. I got fish, other reptiles, turtles, bacteria, sharks, crickets, plants, bugs, alligators, crocodiles, sea life, horseshoe crabs, and amphibians. These are what I would consider the correct answers. There were also some incorrect answers. My best friend included megalodon and dodos in the list, and I think that's because she's played too much Ark Survival Evolved, because while both are extinct, they are both Cenozoic animals, not Mesozoic. But they are also two prominent animals in that game. My sister said woolly mammoths and whales, both of which are again Cenozoic. Now, I didn't tell anyone if they were right or wrong until after they said what they said, and they couldn't think of anything else. And when I told my sister that whales were wrong, she said that she meant whale-like things like sharks. I'm not really sure what that means, but shark had been said multiple times. My nephew had said something that's not really wrong and not quite right either, because he said pterodactyl, which is not the technical term, but if by that he means pterosaurs, then he's absolutely right. He also said small things like mice. Now, the family Muridae is a rodent family that includes rats and mice as well as gerbils, and it evolved in the Miocene. But there were small mammals that were superficially mouse-like in the Mesozoic, so I'm not really sure if I can call this wrong, as I doubt that my nephew has the vocabulary to say basal crown mammals, which is I suspect what he means. I picked this group of people because they were easy to get hold of at 2 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on a Tuesday, and because I know that while none of them are stupid, none of them spend time reading paleontology papers for fun, and none of them have knowing as much as possible about things like Mesozoic fauna as part of their job. Heck, my nephew doesn't even have a job, besides getting good grades in school. And as my sister pointed out, there does not seem to be a school standard where she works about the contents of the paleofauna of any period, and since she's a school principal, she'd probably know. So I have to conclude that most people do know that there were things besides dinosaurs alive during the time of the dinosaurs, even though some of the things they might think of from that time were actually later. And of course, most of them don't really know that saying birds doesn't really count since birds are dinosaurs. In fact, my father asked if maybe there were some birds that were dinosaurs and some that were not. And after he was done, I informed him that that's kind of like asking if there are some dogs that are mammals and some which are not. To which he said, "Oh, okay, got it." So hey, maybe he learned something. Anyway, I wonder what point Pam is going to make about this rather obvious lie she's peddling.
And one of the reasons, the most powerful reasons for doubting that dinosaurs lived millions and millions of years ago.
Oh, so no point. We're just on to soft tissue. Fun.
And didn't live more recently, is some work done in the early 2000s by Dr. Mary Schweitzer.
And let's remember that Dr. Schweitzer is a devout Protestant Christian who says that she loves the Lord, is sick of young Earth creationists dragging her work through the mud, and is a former young Earth creationist who abandoned that belief as she got more educated about paleontology.
And you can actually find this on YouTube. There was a 60 Minutes episode that was done about it. And so this is not, crazy creationist talk. This is mainstream science.
Yep.
She found blood vessels and blood cells.
No, she found round structures localized to the blood vessels that were morphologically consistent with bird blood cells, but they cannot be positively identified as blood cells because the data are insufficient. And
bone cells in dinosaur bone. She found them entirely by accident by dissolving the bone matrix completely away when she meant to dissolve just the outer level away. And it's very consistent. Every time they do this, they get this same soft tissue. And so scientists raised a lot of objections to this. They thought, okay, maybe it's a bacterial biofilm. And she came back and said, all right, I'm going to test it for collagen. Collagen is a protein that's only found in vertebrates.
And hey, when she tested the collagen amino acid sequence, the closest match among living animals was ostrich collagen. I bet Pam won't divulge that little detail.
This stuff tested positive for collagen. It came from a vertebrate. They said, okay, well, maybe it was just somehow completely perfectly sheltered from all water and all oxygen and all everything, but some of the bones that they find these blood vessels in were sticking out of the ground and soaking wet.
That actually doesn't mean much for the interior of the bones. Depending on how they were fossilized, the cavities in the bone could very well be sealed up entirely by the deposition of minerals, meaning that the interior is isolated from water even when the bones erode out of the sediment millions of years later and have rainfall on them.
When they unearthed them.
Savior was born in
So,
David's time.
and there's another gentleman who's done some experiments demonstrating that if you extrapolate them out, potentially soft tissue could last maybe 100,000 years, maybe 1,000,000 years.
What gentleman? Where did he do this? When and where were his results published? I can tell you that the paper Mechanisms of Soft Tissue and Protein Preservation in Tyrannosaurus rex by Boatman et al., published in 2019 in the journal Nature, indicates that cross-linking can allow for the preservation of original structural proteins more or less indefinitely. Oh, and you know who's part of the et al.? That's right, it's Dr. Mary H. Schweitzer. But I should probably bow to the authority of some gentleman of unknown name, unknown expertise, who may or may not have published at some point in an unknown journal.
No way it could last 67 million years. But this dinosaur bone, and from which these samples were found, is supposed to be 67 million years old.
No way apart from cross-linking from Fenton chemistry and glycation, right? Let's not forget that.
So scientists I have a long slide I just skimmed. Scientists have two premises. The first is that the laws of science tell us that soft tissue can not survive for 67 million years.
No, that's not a premise, it's a claim, one we know to be incorrect. Not only do we know it's incorrect, we have mechanisms that can, as far as we know, preserve such tissue as molecular fossils for the required time.
The second premise is that we have T-Rex fossils with soft tissue in them.
This is correct.
And there are two possible conclusions. You can either conclude that the T-Rex individual lived thousands, not millions of years ago, max maybe 1,000,000. Or you can conclude that the laws of science are wrong.
Actually, those would be the same conclusion, because for T-Rex to have lived millions of years ago, we would have to be wrong about virtually all of biology, all of particle physics, and most of relativity. Our options are really, we're wrong about virtually everything we think we know about physics, or maybe there is some cool chemistry we didn't know about a few decades ago. Unsurprisingly, scientists started with the cool chemistry option, as that's far more likely and turns out to seem to have been right. Because again, unlike the previous citation of some gentleman, I managed an actual citation. Cool, isn't it?
I'm going to give you 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count as to what most people conclude.
Is what most people conclude that Pam has no idea what she's talking about because she's deeply incurious about the world and would rather just confirm her own biases?
Okay, and it's not that the T-Rex individual must have lived thousands of years ago. It's that somehow we just don't understand how tissue could have been preserved for 67 million years.
Yes, because in point of fact, that is the option that doesn't break the laws of nature, even if Pam is saying it does. And of course, subsequent investigation has put forth chemistry that can accomplish this without breaking a single law of nature.
I don't know about you, but evolutionists accuse creationists of a God of the gaps argument, of saying, oh, we just don't know how this could have happened, so therefore God.
Which is a thing creationists do.
Well, in this instance, they're doing, well, we don't know how this could have happened, so therefore evolution.
No, we did, gee, that's weird. But there is some experimentation for that we can find if we examine the chemistry of the fossils that we found. And then lo and behold, that's true, there is some chemistry. Science noticed the mystery, investigated the mystery, and found reasons it's less mysterious. Reasons that actually have explanatory power, unlike miracles.
It doesn't really work. Okay, some more evidence that dinosaurs are younger than millions of years. I have a good friend who lives in Ohio.
Friends in Ohio aren't really evidence that non-avian dinosaurs are young.
Who has actually carbon dated dinosaur bones, and so it's impossible to read this even if you're up here, because this is the data of all the different samples he had radio dated. Just so you can see sort of the sheer number of samples that were dated. They were from a number of different dinosaurs. They were sent to a number of different labs, and they all came out with radiocarbon ages between 23,000 and 38,000 years old.
That is the youngest such report that I've ever heard for one of these carbon dating dinosaur scans. I wonder if we're going to get an actual citation, because every other report of this type that I've seen has dates that are basically at the upper range of the carbon dating, meaning that the dates are basically useless and not evidence of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. By the way, near as I can tell, this is an ever so slightly garbled retelling of the works of one Hugo Miller. I want to say a special thanks to science friend Deadly Dakota Raptor for having done the footwork on this some 5 years ago and then giving me the fruit of his labor.
And the limit of detection of radiocarbon dating theoretically is 100,000 years old. Practically, it's somewhere between 43 and 48,000 years old. So these dates actually fall well within the range of what is the limits of detectability.
They do, but the problem is that these were all samples that were submitted after improper controls. In fact, often what was tested were actually things like bone mixed with modern shellac, bones with bits of root in them, bones with obvious insect or bacterial contamination. On top of this, there are sources of radiocarbon underground that don't normally affect living things but can affect fossils, such as the decay of uranium. Further, of course, there were no attempts to publish the results in a real journal, because they couldn't get past peer review because of the horribly sloppy methods. It turns out that if you're willing to mishandle fossils and then pay to have stupid tests done on them, you too can get meaningless, unpublishable results that you can hand off to pseudoscientists so they can spread misinformation.
But the important point here is that they're completely not reconcilable with 67 million years old.
Yeah, because the tests weren't actually done properly. When they are, you get more in the range of 50,000 years or so, which is basically the same thing as they're too old to be carbon dated, which they are. That's why most of the time you actually get creationists reporting these kinds of dates, because most of them are at least too self-conscious to report shellac contamination as evidence of a young Earth.
Absolutely, completely unreconcilable. There should be no carbon-14 in these bones. They should not be able to test any of it. They should max out at their limit of detection, and they're not.
Well, there absolutely should be carbon-14 in those bones, although very little. And they do max out at the limit of detection. You know, when you don't contaminate your samples.
Right? They're testing it much younger. Now, this suggests that these dinosaurs were alive when humans were alive.
Well, good luck finding some human fossils in the same strata.
Which, when I first started learning about all this was probably the most mind-blowing thing I came across, was the soft tissue and the carbon dating in dinosaur bones.
Sounds like it was mind-blowing almost entirely because she has no idea what's going on. It's like a kid having his mind blown by relatively simple things that adults take for granted.
But if you think about it, if you're actually believing that Genesis is literally true...
Which it's not. Genesis contradicts the evidence that we get when we examine reality on its own terms, meaning that we should not treat Genesis as a literal history of the world.
And God created Adam last, and dinosaurs were real, therefore...
Yeah, I guess deciding that you want to be wrong is another way you could go with it.
Dinosaurs must have been created before Adam, so man must have coexisted with dinosaurs.
Hey, I got it right who was doing this, until now not even cited work on dinosaur bones. Props to Deadly Dakota Raptor for recognizing the work based on only the date ranges, because Miller is apparently the only person who is incompetent enough to get dates that are so badly off as a result of contamination.
And, before I get there, this is a letter you probably also can't read because of the slides, but that was sent to Mr. Miller, who was testing the dinosaur bones.
Aw, poor Pam.
I'm going to read a little bit of it to you, because this makes me rather upset.
Yes, how upsetting that upon learning that the results of the lab are being used to lie to people, the lab decided to no longer work with Mr. Miller. That's what's supposed to happen. When you're a fraud like Miller, people should disassociate from you. Miller lied about his results in support of obvious anti-science nonsense. He was using the work of this lab to defraud the public, perhaps not in a legally actionable way, but in the way that academic fraud is usually defined, which is not the same as criminal fraud. Just like Andrew Wakefield shouldn't be given access to vaccine laboratories, and no one is going to just let Eric Dubé onto a rocket ship, Miller is appropriately banned from further abusing the resources of this lab. He can get together his own money and buy his own lab. Indeed, just to get them to process the samples, he probably lied to them about what they were, since any lab with a shred of decency wouldn't let someone waste the thousands of dollars they'd be spending to radiocarbon date something that fundamentally can't have its age determined that way. Imagine someone going to the store for a bag full of rice and telling the cashier that their plan is to use it to make pie crust. I would hope that the cashier might inform them that they have the wrong item and at least alert them that they probably want flour, even if it's rice flour, rather than a whole bag of rice grains. On the other hand, if I found out that the person lied to the cashier saying they were making chicken and rice soup, but instead they were feeding the raw rice to kids who were getting hurt as a result, I'd feel pretty justified in wanting that person banned from the store and letting it be known that they did so that other stores in the future refuse to sell them more rice. That's what Miller did. He lied about what he was doing, then he used the results of that to harm people in the public by further lying about science, and the lab he abused into helping him do this decided to no longer do business with him, so as to no longer be a party to this abuse of the public. If this upsets Pam, then maybe she should do her own radiometric testing, but actually follow the proper controls. Of course she won't, because unless you cheat, you won't get numbers that help anti-evolutionists, because of this one weird trick called young Earth creationists are wrong and the evidence does not, never has, and never will support them.
And he says, Dear Mr. Miller, I've recently become aware of the work that you and your team have been conducting with respect to radiocarbon dating of bone. The scientists at CAIS and I are dismayed by the claims that you and your team have made with respect to the age of the Earth and the validity of biological evolution. Consequently, we are no longer able to provide radiocarbon services in support of your anti-scientific agenda. I have instructed the radiocarbon laboratory to return your recent samples to you and to not accept any future samples for analysis. It's a little bit ridiculous. I mean, people call themselves scientists and they won't...
Won't what? Be a party to the obvious academic fraud and anti-science bullshit of Pam's buddy Hugo?
Accept samples for testing.
Yes, continuing to participate in the lies of Hugo Miller, which before they were at least ignorant of, but continuing to work with him would mean that they are actively participating in misleading the public via dishonesty and the inappropriate use of their equipment. This is laudable. Like, remember how one of Miller's samples was invalid because it was covered in shellac? Did you notice how Pam didn't really tell anyone this? Yeah, Hugo doesn't tend to either. Not telling people why your sample is invalid and just reporting the bogus date you got from it is academic fraud. No one should be okay with that, and that's just one example.
Because they know what it would mean if they did. So, I've worked with scientists. I've been doing science since 2000 as a student. I've done it as a researcher in a laboratory. I've done it as a teacher in schools.
Then Pam should know how seriously wrong what Hugo Miller did, unless, of course, she never actually bothered to look into his work because it confirmed her biases.
And the thing that I most want people to understand about science is that it's not objective.
Data are indeed objective, and while they can lend themselves in many cases to a few alternative interpretations, hence why not all of science is at a consensus about anything that's ever been the subject of an experiment, there are interpretations which we can safely reject because they have been soundly falsified. The young Earth, along with the flat Earth, are in this category. A radiometric dating lab should no more give Hugo Miller access to keep beating that dead horse than NASA should give the flat earthers access to valuable Hubble telescope time just to prove that the Earth is a globe. The conclusions are as set in stone as anything possibly can be, and not because that's how scientists want it, but because the evidence has been so overwhelming, so ubiquitous, and so long-standing that it's time to move on to other questions. We know the Earth is neither flat nor around 10,000 years old. Anyone telling you otherwise is stupid or lying or both.
It is done by individual human beings who have biases, and the difference between a creationist and an evolutionist is a creationist will be honest about their bias.
No, the difference is that the creationists will be dishonest about their data, as we have seen on this channel over and over and over again. It's like a never-ending parade of creationists being dishonest with the data, whether it's Andrew Snelling saying that only a flood could create a fossil while showing a fossil he thinks is post-flood, or it's Nathaniel Jeanson saying that humans are immune to natural selection out of one side of his mouth, but not immune to it from the other side of his mouth. Or it's Gabriella Haynes saying that Archaeopteryx fits the classical Linnaean definition of a bird even though it clearly doesn't. Or if it's Ken Ham saying that a platypus bill is exactly the same as a duck bill. Or it's Kent Hovind saying that he didn't beat his ex-wives and totally would never have sex with a man. Or if it's Stephen Meyer saying that animals originated in the Cambrian, despite knowing about earlier animals, etc., etc., etc. It's nearly impossible to find a creationist who is open and honest with the data. Even the ones who are, like Todd Woods tends to be, will be open about the fact that the data, in fact, support evolution. But that they think evolution is wrong anyway, and they're trying to find support for that contention. Pam needs to open up a movie theater because that was some top-notch projection.
And an evolutionist will think that they don't have any.
Well, if by evolutionist we just mean scientist, then no, that's the whole point of peer review. Scientists are acutely aware of the fact that they have biases and that these can lead them astray. That's why in order for their work to be taken seriously by other scientists, including those who may have the opposite bias, they must take a look at it and approve that it meets the high bar needed to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Even then, sometimes mistakes slip through, and that's why other scientists then go and repeat previous experiments or observations so that the results can be verified or overturned. More or less the whole infrastructure of science publishing is set up to maximally counter researcher bias because it's such a well-known problem.
Now, that's not always in bad faith. Often it's because they simply do not understand that they're making assumptions, because the stuff that they have been presented in these icons has sunk so deeply into their psyche they can't even think past it.
Well, it's not like Pam has been giving us good reasons to reject any aspect of the scientific consensus.
So, skipping a couple slides, because I am running close to time here.
I got all day, literally.
It's a good thing that Mr. Fitzgerald lent me his watch.
Does she not have a cell phone? Like, who uses watches anymore? What's next? Is she going to need a sundial?
So, when I talked about dinosaurs coexisting with humans, there's actually a number of really interesting artifacts that indicate that people could actually, had actually seen dinosaurs, because you cannot draw something that you've never seen. At least you can't draw it accurately.
Okay, so if these alleged pictures of dinosaurs aren't accurate, then they don't count. Got it.
And if I had more time, usually I ask the young people at this point to try to draw a pink fairy armadillo.
So, does that mean that this talk is designed for kids? That might explain why it's so unconvincing and dumb.
And of course, none of them can actually draw what it really looks like. But this is a carving of a Stegosaurus from a temple in Cambodia from, I believe, the 12th century.
Well, is it accurate though? Well, Stegosaurus didn't have projections from its head that looked like horns or ears. It had a much smaller head, a much longer neck, and tail spikes. This has none of this, so this is not accurate. So it doesn't count.
So between the 9th and 12th centuries. So this was long before anybody ever dug up a dinosaur bone, yet this is a perfectly proportional drawing of a Stegosaurus.
I can't really tell if that's a lie or if she's just incredibly stupid. Let me know in the comments what you think, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video.
So these individuals had to know what a Stegosaurus looked like.
Look at this cave painting and see how realistic it is compared to the actual animals like horses and cats. Now you're telling me that this is a perfect representation of a Stegosaurus that could only be done by an artist familiar with Stegosaurus. When the artist gets it that wrong, while other artists could do so much better thousands of years earlier working in a cave by torchlight. Oh, and those spikes on the alleged Stegosaurus are the floral pattern that continues in other carvings of animals above and below this. The actual animal being carved doesn't even have the only thing that even vaguely makes it look like Stegosaurus.
So there's a lot of archaeological evidence that supports human and dinosaur.
He is Christ, the Lord. You will
I can cover.
We're just not going to see any of it.
Before I get cut off. So we'll call it the tree of life, since Mr. Owen objects to that and likes to call it the tree of death, because it is mostly death.
Life dies. If you have a diagram of living things, they got to where they are after a lot of other living things died. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
The only things that are living are the things on the very outer edge. And I also usually ask you if you can find yourself on this tree of life.
I'm like 40 degrees up from the bottom right or something like that. You're way down on the right if you're human.
You are way over in that bottom corner. You showed up on the tree of life at the 59th minute of the 11th hour, and so you as a human being don't look very important in comparison to the rest of this.
I don't even know what that means. What would it mean to be important or unimportant on this chart? It's not like humans on this chart are more or less important than other things listed like the platypus, turtles, clams, red algae, or bacteria.
Which is part of what the icon is communicating to you. You don't matter.
No, it's communicating how much diversity there is and when various major groups of mostly animals evolved and what else was going on at that time. I can't even fathom how someone draws some kind of value judgment about humans from a chart like this.
You're way over there.
One could argue that being at the end point actually indicates the importance of humans, since the whole chart is more or less arranged to put humans at an easy-to-find place and thereby arranges the rest of the organisms in relation to humans. Humans could just have easily been somewhere in the middle.
Right. Mr. Owen is familiar with a gentleman who was working with the Smithsonian to actually construct. See, this is just a graphic. He was actually trying to construct a legitimate tree of life based on DNA sequencing and comparing sequences of different kinds of organisms and looking at dozens and dozens and hundreds of organisms. I'm not going to get the details of the story quite correct, so you may need to ask him about it. But he's looking at just organisms across the whole broad spectrum of life and trying to fit these things into this puzzle in a way that worked. And he presented his findings to his supervisors at the Smithsonian and said only about 30% of what is supposed to fit in this tree actually fits in this tree, and everything else doesn't really fit. And they fired him.
Cool story. I don't believe it.
Because they didn't want to hear it.
Or because it didn't happen because charts like these have been constructed that aren't loosey-goosey graphics but have the terminal branches labeled and include organisms from bacteria to humans. So why was this guy saying that a thing that's been done repeatedly can't be done? My guess is that it's because the story didn't happen. And hey, internet atheists, that's called providing justification for not believing a claim instead of disbelieving a claim. You can do it too with the claim that there is a God that exists. It's okay, the burden of proof is something everyone bears. It won't hurt you, unless of course you actually do have bad reasons for your beliefs, or lack thereof.
Right, so when you look at an image like this, please be aware that it has actually been tested and proven false.
By whom? In what study? Oh, that's right, no one, in no study, because Pam is just lying.
And that lost someone his job.
Some guy who wanted to do something that's done successfully all over the place, but you don't get to know who. You know, I know a guy who worked at the Museum of the Bible, but when he showed that there was never a Bible in the first place, they fired him, even though there is no such thing as a Bible. Wait, you don't believe me? How dare you?
Okay, so trees of life are often based on this concept of homology, which is the idea that you have similar structures that came from similar ancestors.
That's a really sloppy way to phrase it. It's more than organisms share parts that are obviously derived the same way into similar forms developmentally, and that the pattern of this reflects the pattern of ancestry. So the reason that we think that the forelimbs of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat are all composed of a humerus, a radius, an ulna, a bunch of carpal bones, 5 metacarpals, and 5 digits worth of phalanges, which all grow from an initially more or less morphologically identical anterior limb bud, is as a result of them sharing a common ancestor with the same arrangement of bones and embryological development. It's not just a matter of looking around and seeing that some things kind of look the same and then saying that they're obviously homologous and therefore evolution.
But homology is somewhat undermined by this idea of convergent evolution, which tells you that you can have similar structures that do not derive from similar ancestors, because nobody claims that a pterodactyl is closely related to a bat.
But that's where you check the underlying anatomy. Bird wings, bat wings, and pterosaur wings are homologous as forelimbs, but the way they diverge in development from that basic development of a generic tetrapod limb into their specialized wing forms differs. In birds, only 3 digits develop, and then in embryo they all fuse together. In pterosaurs, 4 digits develop, but one, the 4th, grows extremely long and robust to support a wing membrane. In bats, 5 digits develop, and all but the first one grows into a long and usually curved finger that supports multiple wing membranes. As a result, the adult morphology is superficially similar, but when you look at the actual underlying anatomy, you can see that it's very different. This means that despite the limbs being homologous as limbs, they are analogous as wings. That is, the common ancestor of these animals did not have wings, but instead more generalized forelimbs, which were probably just legs.
Or that a bat is closely related to a butterfly, yet they all have wings that function in very similar ways.
And with butterflies, it's even more different. For one thing, they don't have any limb buds like tetrapods do at all, and their wings don't even grow as limbs at all. They're extensions of the exoskeleton, something tetrapods don't even have. Further, they're not made of the same things, being primarily made of chitin as opposed to the skin and keratin which compose the wings of bats, pterosaurs, and birds. This means that these organisms are even more distantly related. So if you took bats, birds, pterosaurs, and butterflies together, clearly butterflies would be the odd one out. From there, the details of skull and vertebrae would pretty easily mark out the bat as the next group that's not like the remaining two, leaving birds and pterosaurs as the most closely related to each other out of the group. And hey, what do you know? We've just created the same cladogram that everyone would get when examining these animals. It's almost like analogy isn't a big problem except in organisms that are rather closely related. In many cases, so closely related that creationists would count them as being in the same kind anyway. For example, maybe more than one equid lineage lost their 2nd and 4th digits independently, rather than sharing a common ancestor with only one digit, digit 3. That's possible, and it would be hard to figure out if that happened at all, or if equids alive today share a single toed ancestor, without an excellent genome sequence and or a really good fossil record. But no one is going to come up and say that for this reason, maybe some equids were actually more closely related to cassowaries than they are to other equids, or that this means that they don't form a monophyletic clade.
So you have similar structures that are used to create these trees of life, but some of these similar structures don't actually imply ancestry.
Yes, because they are only superficially similar. The superficiality is important to this, and I can't think of any reasons why Pam would gloss over that don't involve dishonesty.
And in fact, some very complicated similar structures, like the bacterial flagellum, are said to have evolved separately 5 different times.
And eyes probably evolved at least that many times. So what? Wings evolved a similar number of times, once in insects, once in pterosaurs, once in birds, once in Scansoriopterygid dinosaurs, and once in bats. Similar pressures can lead to superficially similar structures that perform the same functions.
So not only is this complex assemblage of proteins that requires 40 different proteins to work correctly, and they all have to be present in the correct proportions at the correct time to be assembled and inserted
Find him wrapped in swaddlecloth.
into and gentlemen, it happened 5 times independently.
Evolution can produce complex structures. If it can do it once, it can do it more than once. I don't see the problem here. Simply being complex and interconnected isn't a barrier for evolution. If Pam wants to say that flagella are a problem for evolution, she's going to need to be more specific than simply being incredulous that it might have happened a few times. I'm not even conceding that it did. I haven't read Snyder at all, and whether they're right or if perhaps the flagellum actually evolved once but was lost in many lineages, or if it evolved once and spread by horizontal gene transfer or some combination, doesn't really matter to me. I don't see why any of this is a problem on its own for evolution.
We've just made evolution infinitely more impossible.
I don't see how.
But that's okay.
No, it's not okay. This demands an actual explanation. What about the flagellum is so impossible in the first place? I mean, I know usually the answer is nonsense about irreducible complexity, but Pam didn't even argue for that. So I don't know if that's why she thinks flagella are impossible for evolution. She just asserted that they evolved a few times, and therefore problems. I don't see how that follows at all. This is easily solved by simply looking at the embryology and defining homology in terms of developmental biology. Then they provide evidence for common ancestry, which also cross-confirms genetic phylogeny and character-based cladistics. See how easy that was? It's almost like maybe all the anatomists and evolutionary biologists have thought about this at some point during the decades of their lives they have spent doing more or less nothing but working in this field. Remember, if you think you spotted some obvious problem in a field that has had people spending their whole lives becoming experts in it, and those people are just blind to the obvious problem, the most likely explanation is that they have thought of that, it's not a problem, or it has a well-known solution, and you're simply too ignorant to really have an informed take on the whole topic. That's what's going on here with Pam.
So this does actually lead us to a little bit of a case of circular reasoning, because we have homologous structures that are supposed to indicate that an organism has a common ancestor, but the common ancestor is what is the reason that allows us to determine that these structures are homologous.
No, we don't, and we can tell because the word homologous entered English in 1650, and was talked about long before universal common ancestry was widely accepted. People like Carolus Linnaeus recognized that some structures were fundamentally made of the same anatomy, just twisted and stretched in different ways. And they use words like homology, homologous, and homologize to describe such things. This is something that can be recognized without any reference to common ancestry. Indeed, some creationists like Marcus Ross and Matt McLean use the word homologous in their pretend paleontology papers for creationist LARP journals, while themselves neither accepting nor advocating for common ancestry.
So we really have to be able to prove that they had a common ancestor before we can say that the structure is homologous.
No, we don't, and we can tell because the word homologous entered English in 1650, and was talked about long before universal common ancestry was widely accepted. People like Carolus Linnaeus recognized that some structures were fundamentally made of the same anatomy, just twisted and stretched in different ways. And they use words like homology, homologous, and homologize to describe such things. This is something that can be recognized without any reference to common ancestry. Indeed, some creationists like Marcus Ross and Matt McLean use the word homologous in their pretend paleontology papers for creationist LARP journals, while themselves neither accepting nor advocating for common ancestry. Yes, that was just a repeat of the previous thing I said. If she's not going to actually continue her point, I'll just repeat myself.
But often the common ancestor is assumed, so therefore the structure is homologous, so therefore we've proven that these animals have a common ancestor. Yeah, don't ever do that, guys. Okay?
Was that a joke?
That's circular logic. Bad arguments, bad reasoning. So I wanted to talk a little bit about vestigial organs, because vestigial organs are thought to be sort of evolutionary leftovers. They're thought to give some more credence to this idea of common ancestry. And at one time, it was thought that human beings had about 180 vestigial organs.
I can probably think of like 20 vestigial organs in humans off the top of my head, but I have no idea if there is a consensus on the total number. I do know that some organs were once thought to be vestigial, like the pineal gland, but turned out to have retained their ancestral function and so are not vestigial.
And these were thought to be things that were kind of leftover, useless, didn't have any function in human beings, but had somehow served some kind of function in primates.
Wrong. Very wrong. Vestigial structures do not have to lack function. They have to lack or have greatly diminished capacity for the ancestral function. So an ostrich wing has both balance and display functions, but it fails entirely for the ancestral wing function of allowing for flight. Thus, ostrich wings are vestigial. Anyone with a biology degree telling you that some organ isn't vestigial because it has a function at all is lying to you. In humans, a great example is the coccyx. It's a vestigial tail, in that it doesn't extend past the body wall where it could do things like help with balance or work as a sensory organ. It does attach some pelvic muscles, though, so it has a function. This in no way makes it not vestigial.
And one of the most common that shows up still, even in high school biology textbooks, which is a crying shame, are tonsils and your appendix.
Well, the appendix isn't vestigial, but not because it has a purpose. It turns out that it's probably not homologous with the vermiform cecum in other animals, which in those animals serves a digestive function. Instead, it's probably evolved for its current immunological function and as a reservoir for helpful gut bacteria in times of gastric infection. As for the tonsils, they are indeed vestigial because in relatives of humans, they play a major role in preventing orally introduced infections. But in humans, they barely function for this purpose at all, although they do perform the function in a very limited way. So yes, tonsils are vestigial. Remember, being vestigial is about retaining full ancestral function, not simply lacking any and all function.
And as an immunologist, this bothers me deeply because your tonsils and your appendix are immune tissue. They're part of your immune system and also part of your lymphoid. Your tonsils are part of your lymphoid system.
None of which precludes them from being vestigial.
And they perform an important function in your body. You can survive without them, just like you can survive without your right hand. That does not mean that they do not have a function.
But you see, in humans, the ancestral function of hands, in common with other apes, is for grasping things. That's still the primary function of hands, and barring congenital problems or severe injury, they're still really functional for that. They're not vestigial. Now, like I said, the appendix is probably not vestigial, but the immune function of the tonsils is very minor, and so they are reasonably termed vestigial, since the infection rate without them is essentially the same as the infection rate for people with intact tonsils. Now, that's not to say we should go back to the days of routine tonsillectomies for basically everyone. Surgery is risky, and bearing those risks for what may be no benefit is silly.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure that a function has been found for every one of these 180 organs.
Incorrect. For example, there is no known practical function for the erector pili muscles that give humans goosebumps. But even if it were true that such a function had been found, it would mean nothing about whether these organs are vestigial or not, because being functionless isn't part of the definition of vestigiality.
And including some more organs that we've discovered since then that also have functions. So your body is actually really functional, but this is still presented as an argument for evolution.
Because an intelligent designer who needed to attach some pelvic muscles probably wouldn't create a tail in an embryonic ape, only for it to be reabsorbed, but only mostly leaving just a weird stubby end of the spine where those muscles go for some reason. And those muscles just happen to attach to the tail in similar organisms that retain a tail, like most non-ape monkeys. But if evolution is true, evolution can't simply start a design over. It has to work with what it's got. And if that means that some important muscles attach to the tail, then even when an organism evolves to lack an external tail, those muscles have to go somewhere. And if it's a weird stubby tail that's entirely internal, then so be it. The animal will have a vestigial tail, like all apes, humans included, have.
That, just like Mr. Owen was talking about last night with the lanugo, this coat of hair, the only thing it could be is sort of a leftover from our primate ancestry.
Yeah, she's not going to give the supposed function for lanugo in humans. In case you don't know, it's a body-wide coating of hair that develops in embryonic humans around the time of birth. In some humans, it falls out just before birth, and some humans are born with it only for it to fall out shortly after birth. I will not be making a claim as to whether it's vestigial.
And one of the common examples given is ostrich wings, and I like this example because, of course, ostriches can't fly.
That's true.
And the only purpose of having wings is to fly, right?
No.
See how she's already setting up the straw man?
Nope.
Right, guys? They're like, yes, no, maybe so. They weren't listening. Okay, they are now. All right. So ostriches are actually really intriguing organisms. They live in very arid, very hot environments, and they have a beautiful air conditioning system. And it's a network of blood vessels that's very close to the surface of their body.
This is going to be long-winded, isn't it?
And as those blood vessels go close to the surface of their body and the air is cooler than their bodies, that actually brings cooler blood back into the core. And then at night, of course, they're going to have to be able to cover these blood vessels because otherwise they would get chilled, and that would be problematic. So it turns out these blood vessels are located on the underside of their wings.
Neat, a vestigial structure that retains some function, like most of them. But you'll notice how they admittedly don't do the main thing wings do, that is, allow for flight. That's why they're vestigial. If God wanted an animal with some blood vessels that could be moved around, he didn't need to make a whole damn wing that's morphologically the same as any other bird wing, but proportionally tiny and missing some of the muscles that would allow it to be effectively flapped, just so he can slap some extra blood flow in there, in the exact way it might look if ostriches had evolved from flight-capable birds.
So when you see an ostrich sort of flutter its wings, like it does at the zoo, it's cooling itself down. It is exposing those blood vessels that are near the surface of the skin to cooler air so that cool blood can go back into the core and lower the body temperature of the ostrich so it doesn't overheat. At night in the desert, when it gets very cold, they tuck their wings up right next to them, cover up those blood vessels and preserve that body heat.
Which is admittedly cool, just irrelevant.
So ostrich wings, instead of being a vestigial, useless organ, are actually a highly efficient air conditioning and heating system.
Which are vestigial organs. Neato.
So this brings me to genetics, which is my favorite thing, because that's what I did for a really long time. I worked at the Genome Sequencing Center at WashU, not on the Human Genome Project, but right after that on some projects that came through, including lamprey and platypus.
I gotta say, I did not know that there had been a lamprey genome project. That's pretty cool.
That's not really as exciting as it sounded. I never actually got to see a platypus, just a tube of DNA from a platypus.
That's too bad. They're pretty adorable, even if the males are rather dangerous, what with those venomous heel spurs.
But genetics is the new homology. So we've seen that, we have these structures that look homologous, but maybe they're not.
Lying in a manger.
Instead, we'll turn to DNA sequences, and we look at DNA sequences. And this is actually a protein sequence, but DNA sequences code for protein sequences.
Well, the ones in genes do. Most DNA sequences aren't part of genes in organisms like lampreys, platypus, or humans.
And we look and we see how many of those base pairs or how many of those amino acids are conserved across all these different species. We can come up with a much better way of classifying species. We can come up with a more clear tree of life. And what Ian got fired over was this kind of data.
No one was fired for coming up with DNA sequences.
So it's thought, just like common structures, that common genes or genes that are shared are thought to be evidence of common ancestry.
Yes, because genes come from your ancestors, and that's how ancestry and paternity tests work. It's also how forensic DNA testing can work. If you have the DNA of, say, a murderer, but you don't have a full match, but they get a partial match hit from someone else in a database, they can find that the match is likely a sibling or parent, and then narrow down the pool of suspects based on common ancestry. The basic fact that DNA is the molecule of inheritance should be all anyone needs to realize that absent some compelling reason to think otherwise, DNA gives you definitive evidence of relatedness. I'm guessing that we won't get anything compelling in the next few minutes.
And the closer that they are between two species, the closer the relatedness is thought to be. So this leads us to some really interesting genetic anomalies.
No, it's more like a third, and it's not that those genes are unique to humans and bananas, it's that those genes are basically common to all organisms with a nucleus in their cells. And these genes tend to be extremely important for basic cellular function, explaining why they're so highly conserved across so many organisms. Further, this kind of similarity is expected in evolution and is evidence of it. Pam and her audience incredulity doesn't change that.
You're half banana.
I guess the idea of common ancestry with banana plants is amusing for some reason, even though evolution requires all eukaryotes to share genes if they're in fact related, although it's not as high as 50% between plants and animals.
I hope you're okay with that. I hate banana. You also share the same hemoglobin found in many plants.
You don't even have the same hemoglobin as all other humans. Hemoglobin isn't a single molecule, it's a class of proteins that carry oxygen. Plants have several varieties, none of which are identical to amniote hemoglobin. Basically, if an organism uses a protein with iron to move oxygen around, that protein is called hemoglobin. Maybe Pam is just being stupid here rather than lying, but there are over 1,000 types of hemoglobin just within the human species, so it's logically impossible for plants to have the same kind of hemoglobin as humans, because there's no one human hemoglobin.
Now this would normally suggest to an evolutionary biologist that you share a close and recent ancestor with the plant.
Well, it would suggest that if the strongman version Pam is going for were true. It's not.
Some of my students maybe, but there's also an analysis that showed that rabbits were closer to monkeys than they were to other rodents.
A single analysis that isn't even cited from nearly 3 decades ago before reliable gene sequencing? Okay, we got anything that actually confirms that? Of course not. That's why it's only one analysis, and only from back before the analysis could be done as reliably as now. I don't think she's even trying at this point.
So they're going to redraw the tree so that rabbits are coming off of the primate branch.
No, they're not.
There was another study done same year that sea urchins are closer to vertebrates than they are to any other invertebrate.
Yeah, echinoderms are deuterostomes, like vertebrates, so this checks out. This is the predicted outcome based on embryology.
Another study that showed that cows are more related to whales than they are to horses.
Again, both are artiodactyls, so this is the predicted outcome. In fact, we already saw the fossils linking basal artiodactyls to whales. Horses are parasidactyls, the other group of ungulates. All artiodactyls are more closely related to each other than any of them are to any parasidactyl.
This one's my favorite. A single-chain antigen receptor protein shows that sharks are closely related to camels.
Oh, what did all the other proteins show? Because yeah, I bet there are weird similarities in a single of the 22,000 or so proteins between any two vertebrates. But on the whole, they tend to come out in line with evolutionary predictions. Like, how much more blatant could the cherry picking be?
I mean, they both have, like, things on their back, right? And the last one, bats and dolphins both have a sonar system that is almost identical on a molecular level.
But at the genetic level, they're as different as they possibly could be. You know, because the protein sequence is selected for. But the neutral variation that is part of the genetic sequence isn't. meaning that we should expect the same protein with different underlying genes, which is what we do find. This is actually an excellent example of molecular analogy, and how we can distinguish it from homology.
And all of this clearly proves that bunnies come from tomato plants.
Something no evolutionary biologist has ever suggested, of course, because the common ancestor of bunnies and tomato plants would have been some single-celled eukaryote, not a tomato plant or a bunny.
Okay, so you get some weird things, and so this is some actual data that would have been run into by this gentleman at the Smithsonian, showing that, when I look at things, so I look at sharks and I say, well, sharks should be more closely related to other kinds of fish, except they share this really common trait with the mammal that lives in the desert.
Yeah, this one trait of a single antigen receptor. Ooh. Also, they should actually be no more closely related to bony fish than to humans. Humans and dinosaurs are more closely related to bluefin tuna than bluefin tuna are to sharks, and vice versa.
These are the kinds of anomalies that you're going to identify, and they crop up all over the place, and that's why most animals don't actually fit into a neat, ordered tree of life.
Funny then how they actually do basically every time we try, except at the very tips and very base. And the tips because of things like incomplete lineage sorting and the occasional gene flow, and at the bottom because of horizontal gene transfer.
And the morphological characteristics sometimes contradict the genetic characteristics.
Very rarely, and that usually goes away the minute you bother to look more than skin deep, like with Pam's own example of different animal wings.
So what does all this mean?
That Pam has no clue what she's talking about. But that's about as much Pam as I can take for a single day. Let's check back in on her in another week. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please hit the like button and tell me what you enjoyed in the comments. If you didn't, feel free to hit dislike, and likewise tell me what your problem was in the comments. I'll probably at least read, if not respond to all of them. Either way, I hope you subscribe if you haven't already, and if you are subscribed, or just subscribed now, click the bell icon and see if you have notifications turned on so you can get notified when I have new content. Stay safe out there, I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovend, Phil Ravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Denny5252, Eleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostock Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Monkey They Them, Robert Carpenter, Sphincter of Doom, Vollus, Strawberry Vein, and Ita V. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.